Hey guys, welcome back. So now we're jumping back into Immortal X-Men, and for this one, not only do we find that Destiny nearly has to blow her cover and show her cards to Sinister, but also the events of X-Men Volume 6 make their way here into Immortal X-Men, and it makes the story twice as sinister as it was before. But with that said, let's get into it. But first, if you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe to catch the spills every week, and don't forget to hit that bell up top so we can squat up in the comments for the first hour. Alright, so at this point, when we jump back in, it's said to have been a year since the events of the planet-sized X-Men one-shot, back when Magneto and a group of other mutants terraformed Mars, which would later be established as Planet Araco. And this was something that we went much more into depth with during the Judgment Day event, when I did a bit of a run-through of the events leading into X-Men Red. But at this point with Immortal X-Men, we're going to be briefly passing through some of the events of the Hellfire Gala, as well as X-Men Volume 6. And as we continue, I'll be tying the references from those issues as they make their way into Immortal X-Men. But at this point, when we jump back in, we begin with Emma Frost, where in her case, she usually sleeps in her diamond form, but on the night before the Hellfire Gala, there's just way too much on her mind. And through the course of this, we follow Emma as her mind is racing and she's thinking about a number of things, some of which include her comparing herself to Jean, while also admitting that she knows why she's not quote-unquote up there with Jean. Which from there takes Emma into thinking about her snow phase, because Emma's got a past. She's done some cruel things. But again, for the most part, the reason why Emma's mind is racing and jumping from one thing to the next, it's mainly because of her having a mixture of nervousness and excitement for the Hellfire Gala. And on one hand, it's to be expected, because there's going to be guests from around the world as well as from across the galaxy. But nonetheless, because of Emma's anxiety, it's bringing a lot of old memories to the forefront, to where eventually we'll come to find that it's put her in a quite delicate state. But for Emma, one of the last things that comes to mind just before she dozes off is how this gala is going to be ushering in a new era, and it's a shame that they don't have a huge announcement like the terraforming of Mars that happened last year, because that was big, with mutants bringing life to what was otherwise a dead world. But now, alongside of the gala, there's no huge story to break. And from here, Emma then goes on to think about the article written by Ben Urich, who's the reporter that had discovered that the mutants had figured out immortality. And for a moment, Emma thinks of it like, yeah, well, this would have been nice if it happened after the gala. And she's imagining if this was something that the mutants wanted to share or present, it would have been nice if it was the Hellfire Gala's one more thing. But also, while we're on the topic of the world knowing about the mutants' resurrection, this is something that Ben Urich has been suspicious of for some time, and for a while he would ask Cyclops a number of questions, which eventually led to him asking about the X-Men going up to space and dying up there, only to later show up on Earth like nothing happened. But then later Urich was given his confirmation by Dr. Stasis, who had given him records of an autopsy that was done on Scott Summers, who Ben had just spoken to a few days ago. And later on, we would see that the very public death of Scott Summers had pretty much been the catalyst of the X-Men's big secret getting out, because even though the mutants had tried to cover up the return of Cyclops, with him being Captain Krakoa and putting Captain Krakoa with the X-Men, soon after things had kind of went left, because we discovered that Synch had just reacted after the public death of Cyclops. And because he didn't know that Scott was going to make an attempt to reach out to Ben Urich, Synch borrowed Jean's powers and he erased Urich's memories of what he knew about mutant resurrection. But of course, with him doing this, his intentions were good, but shortly after he would discover that the initial article that Urich was going to write was a positive one, with much admiration for the X-Men, with it saying that they were an example to mutants everywhere. But later Synch went to Urich with Cyclops, and he came clean, telling Urich that he could give him those memories back. But Urich declined and told the two of them that he wanted to go on and write the article without being given an interpretation of his own interpretation. So from there, he went on to put out the article, and from how it read, for the most part, it seems like what he would have put out anyway. But then after this, fast forward to Judgment Day, and it was here where we saw like the peak of humanity's pushback, at least until they found someone else to be mad at, which not too long after was the Eternals. But from here, going back to Immortal X-Men, when we follow Emma, for her, it comes to a point where she's like, what's the worst that could happen? To where then we fast forward to after the gala, and we find Emma covered in blood. But it isn't long before we're shown what exactly happened earlier that night, because as Emma was leaving, she was approached by Ambassador Ming-Yu, who asked for a moment of Emma's time, but she just continued walking, telling him that she was busy. To where then he went on to say, with what? Immortality? Because the mutants gave humans medicine that would extend the human's life 5 years. Meanwhile, the whole time, mutants were hiding immortality. And at first, Emma continues to go on her way, while telling the ambassador that they can talk about this another time. But then he insists, no, now is the right time. And he goes on to tell her how it could be helpful for others, and how with this, mutants have something that everyone wants. And Emma goes on to tell him more or less that it isn't a gift that they can just wrap up and hand over to somebody. It's a limited resource, and it's not a technology that can be duplicated. But with the public news also being that it only works on mutants, it's here where the ambassador's like, is that something that's by choice? Like it won't work? Or the mutants just don't want to share? And it's here where she cuts him off and just says, over 16 million mutants dead, which of course is a reference to Genosha and all the mutants that were killed by Mega Sentinels that were produced by Master Mold. But she goes on to tell him that 16 million mutants were murdered, and humanity just sat by and watched. And some of humanity even cheered. And on top of that, there were some people who even made a profit off of selling the parts that manufactured the Sentinels. But with saying this, she goes on to tell him that her people come first. And for Emma, her points are very valid, and the ambassador even tells her that he understands her position. But then he goes on to propose that the mutants give access to their leaders, key donors, industry figures, and he goes on to let her know that at the end of the day, Krakoa has made deals to secure its future, and doing this wouldn't be too different. And with hearing this, Emma looks over her shoulder and she lets him know that she'll take it to the council. But then in front of her, someone calls her name, and before she knows it, she's covered in sheep's blood. But just after this happens, Emma scans this woman's mind, and come to find out her husband had died not too long ago in a boating accident. And for Emma, with her touching this woman's mind, she feels what that woman feels, and she knows that something has to be done so that hopefully this type of outlash can go away. And after this, we then jump over to the Quiet Council meeting, where at this point, Emma has shared with the council her conversation with the ambassador and how the idea of sharing more with humanity could benefit Krakoa. But when she does, Sinister gets up and he is so sincere. And he's like, hey, perhaps this is an opportunity. Because if the world leaders will let me clone them, I can meddle with their genes a little bit, and I can even put a kill switch in each one of the world leaders. But not too long after hearing this, Charles is just pretty much like, man, sit your sinister ass down. Talk about putting kill switches in people's heads. But also, speaking of sick people, it's here where Charles lets everyone know that he had just got news about a man who had injected himself with the mutant growth hormone to only then kill himself because he believed that he would come back as a mutant. And with Charles sharing this information with everyone, initially the room is just speechless, but then Exodus is like, we can't be blamed for humanity's stupidity, to where the Nightcrawler's like, man, come on, somebody died. You gotta feel some type of sympathy or even empathy because this one guy could be the beginning of many. But then in response, Mystique tells her son, with him having all this talk about humanity, like, are you sure that you should be on a mutant council? But then Sebastian Shaw quickly chimes in and he tells Mystique that at the least, she should understand that this is bad PR for the mutants. And even if she doesn't care, at least look like it in public. But also Shaw believes that this is something that they could potentially turn for a profit. But then it's here where Emma tells Shaw and the others that they should more or less put a pin in this discussion because there's something else that she wants to bring to their attention before they go any further. And moving forward, Emma gets confirmation from the other psychics in the room for them to confirm that what she's about to share is valid and that they are indeed memories from Scott Summers' mind. And going forward, Charles, Exodus, and even Sinister concurs that they are. And it's from here where Emma goes on to show them the recent update of the fight between the X-Men and Dr. Stasis. And with what Emma's sharing, this takes us over to X-Men Volume 6, where throughout that whole series, Dr. Stasis has been stepping in and out of the shadows, with him seeing Krakoa as a cancer to the world that needs to be removed. But rather than him staging some full-on attack, he had first had a fixation on figuring out how the mutants were resurrecting their dead. And throughout this series, not only were we shown that he had conducted this autopsy on Cyclops, the one that he had handed over to Ben Urich, with the intentions of discovering the secrets of mutant resurrection, but also with the very public death of Cyclops that we had talked about earlier. Not only was this attack staged by Dr. Stasis with the intent of killing Cyclops, but also with him watching this attack from nearby. When he noticed that Cyclops wasn't killed, he stepped in under the disguise of an ambulance worker and he finished the job himself, with him first telling Cyclops that they'll try a little experiment, with Dr. Stasis telling him exactly where he could find him so that he could see if Cyclops would remember when he came back. And later on in issue 11, we would come to find that Cyclops would go after Dr. Stasis, but with using the help of Synch, who had borrowed both the powers of Jean Grey and Wolverine, with Wolverine's senses helping them track down the specific location of Dr. Stasis. But at one point, with the scent of one of his henchmen going towards the right and the scent of Stasis going towards the left, Cyclops and Synch split up. And when Cyclops found Dr. Stasis, things escalated rather quickly. But then also, it was this fight between the two of them that led Summers to hitting Dr. Stasis in the face numerous times, to where then finally, Scott shot Dr. Stasis at point blank range with his optic blast, destroying his helmet and finally revealing his face to be Mr. Sinister, with a club on his forehead instead of a diamond. And as we continue, we'll dive deeper into the details of Dr. Stasis and the other Sinisters, as well as their origin. But at this point in time, with Emma revealing the memories of Scott Summers to the entire council, including Mr. Sinister, the one who's been with the council, it's here where she goes on to tell them that the Sinister from Scott's memories, Dr. Stasis, he claims to be the original Sinister. But with Emma showing this to the entire council, including Diamond Sinister, the Sinister we've known for the longest, it's here where he's just at a loss for words. So then next, he just drops a BAMF bomb, which was undoubtedly crafted from Nightcrawler's abilities, but Sinister tweaked it so it's heavy on the brimstone smell. So there's plenty of sulfur to give it a whole lot more of that rotten egg scent. And of course, you know, Nightcrawler's taking that as an insult, and rightfully so. But shortly after, with Sinister making his escape, it isn't long before Exodus spots him in the crowd. So then from here, Sinister then takes a few pills, which then give him the abilities of Matthew Madrox, the Multiple Man. And from here, members of the council just start taking down all these different Sinisters, which was kind of fun to watch for a moment, with multiple Sinisters getting beat up or struck by lightning. But we would find out soon after this that the real Sinister was actually getting away. But before he can make his way through the gate that would take him to a secret lab, he turns around and he finds Destiny right there. And with how this is done, she could have got the drop on him, but instead she gets his attention and she asks him, "Don't you want to know what's going on?" To where then she tells him, "You can't run from this, don't be a coward." But in response, Sinister is just like, "Well, thanks for the food for thought, it was nice catching up." He shoots at her, she jumps out the way, and he just goes on through the gate. But as it turns out, with Destiny really more or less letting Sinister get away, she's trusting Sinister, or more or less hoping, that he'll respond or react to what she said, and not panic and go kill one of his Moiras and reset the timeline. And really for Destiny at this point, it's more of a waiting game. And over with Sinister, we see him put the gun to Moira's head, but then he thinks it through for a bit, and he realizes that Destiny could have got the drop on him, but for some reason she let him go. And with him thinking this over, he knows that she knows something, but he's not sure what it is exactly that she does know. But after going back and forth with himself, eventually Sinister reluctantly decides not to go through with destroying the timeline, and he makes his way to go back. But before he does, for safe measures, he does a bit of a personality purge and clean install, so that when he goes back, he'll be able to do a bit of a performance and convincingly persuade the council that he's not up to anything and that he sincerely wants to clear his name. And really for Sinister, this is partially true, because on one hand, he does want to learn more about this other Sinister, but also he wants to keep his Moira project a secret. But from here we see Sinister come back to the Quiet Council and turn himself in, and give them this whole speech about how he wants to clear his name, and how he wants to cooperate and figure this whole thing out. But then all of a sudden this glowing light takes form under him, and before anyone can do anything, Sinister is kidnapped by the Eternals, and this right here takes us into the events of Avengers vs. X-Men vs. Eternals Judgment Day, which I have a link to down below in case anyone needs to get caught up, or if you want to see more about how Sinister's story continued throughout Judgment Day. And so now real quick, I want to give a special shout out to all the patrons. Thank you guys for all of your support. And for anyone who's new here who wants more information on how to support the channel, I got a link below where you can go to patreon.com/Dopespill. But that'll do it for this one, guys. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, and we'll do it again on the next one. Alright, later.